Good morning. I'm Adrian Dix. I'm the BC Minister of Energy and Climate Solutions. Today, you won't be hearing from me very much or from Jeremy Valeriat. You'll be hearing from our outstanding reviewers, Dan Vinelovich and Maren Smith, about their report Rising to the Moment, their review of Clean BC. I just want to just put it briefly in time and context on May the 7th, we announced this review, and obviously a lot of work was done in preparing for it, the review after that. And so what you see, this document you see, is a result of enormous effort by people who participated and by our reviewers to deliver a review of this size and this quality in such a short period of time. I think the reason that we really worked to have a short time frame is we think the moment is urgent. The moment is urgent for people in their daily lives on affordability. The moment is urgent for our economy, and the moment is urgent to reduce emissions and to ensure that Clean BC does what it needs to do to encourage all three of those things. So we work together, and I just want to acknowledge the work of Maren and Dan, which is excellent, and you'll, I think, be very interested in what they have to say. But I also wanted to acknowledge the work of Jeremy and his team. We agreed to do this review, to advance the review of Clean BC, which was a statutory review, by a year as part of the agreement between the BC NDP government and the BC Green Caucus. And we really worked together and listened to each other and came to agreement on terms of reference and came to agreement on two remarkable reviewers. And I give Jeremy a lot of credit for that, for his ideas, his determination, and the work we've done together. It's always difficult, I think, in politics to come together and to compromise and to get things done. And we really did this. And he's been a really excellent partner in this initiative. And I want to thank him personally. And then I want to introduce him to say a few words.
Thanks. Thank you, Minister. Yeah, I'm very proud. I'm Jeremy Valeriat, MLA for West Vancouver Sea to Sky, and one member of the BC Green Caucus, and I'm really proud that we came to an agreement with the government that included this review. It's a really important time for it. I really want to thank the reviewers, Dan and Maren, who've put their professional lives and maybe sometimes their personal lives on hold for the last 6 months to get this done on time and do a very thorough job. It's an important moment. I'll acknowledge some political headwinds, but it's really an important time for us to have this discussion and move forward on climate. And I'm excited to see this review go out into the world and to hear the reaction to it and build on, move forward with the discussion that it provokes. So thank you.
Thank you. And now, Maren Smith, Dan Vinelovich, it's over to you. Thank you very much.
Great. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. We're really excited to share with you the report and the recommendations that we're making. We've really focused on some practical and actionable advice, recognizing that a lot has changed since Clean BC was first launched in 2018, and we think that we need to meet the moment in terms of what next steps look like for the province. We'll start just with a little bit about the review. So as was mentioned, it's happened over the last 6 months. We met with over 150 organizations, received 279 written submissions, over 2,600 public engagement surveys were completed. We engaged with Indigenous leadership organizations and received submissions from individual nations. And we had multiple engagement with the Climate Solutions Council, the council that advises the minister on climate policy in the province. We were briefed by officials extensively. We had access to experts across different ministries. We also engaged with other experts in the field, drew on our own experience and expertise, and also did a scan of what's happening in other jurisdictions around the world.
Yeah, and to build on what Dan said, just to say that feedback came from every corner of this province. From across the economy, all different business sectors. So it was extensive, and what we found surprising was that there was more consensus than there was disagreement. So in a nutshell, we've given you a 100-page report here, but here's the key findings out of it. One, Clean BC is working, and what's needed is a renewal, not a retreat from Clean BC. So people have said to us, Clean BC is working. We're not going to meet our targets. What's going on? I'm going to give you a few examples. So the methane regulations. Gas production in British Columbia is up 60% since 2014. Methane emissions are down 60%. So we've increased production, reduced pollution. We now have in 2024, 6 billion liters of biofuels were in the system being burned in transportation, reducing emissions by 4 megatons. Heat pumps in 2023, more heat pumps were delivered to British Columbia than gas furnaces. The uptake of these things by citizens is happening. The EV mandate is working. It was set to have 220,000 electric vehicles on the road by the end of 2025. BC hit that target in July. So these policies are working. Some of them take time. And our advice is really extend and strengthen some of these ones that are working. They're in place. This is the easiest thing for government to do. No need to spend time developing new legislation, new regulations. Use what we've got and that business is adapted to. Some of them need to be calibrated for regional fairness. It's true, one size doesn't fit all in this province. We're a big province with some regions colder than others. So some of these, and we'll go into details, can be calibrated. For example, the zero emission building code. Others, if they're not working right now and there's an affordability issue around it, then let's modify them. Let's take the existing reg and modify. For example, get rid of the top end of the energy step code for buildings and make that voluntary. Where targets can't be achieved, it's much better for us to just adjust them and calibrate them than to scrap them. They are working. We just need to calibrate for the moment here. And so things like the electric vehicle mandate are an example of that. We've actually found that, we had the experience from the carbon tax. So one of our pieces of advice here is around recycling any revenues that come from climate solutions, from climate policies, back into climate solutions, and to do that transparently. That's what British Columbians want and expect. And then finally, there's a lot of co-benefits from these policies around affordability, competitiveness, setting the economy up for success going forward, for health. And so let's talk about those range of benefits when we're talking about the Clean BC policies.
So we heard from people from all parts of the province, from organizations, from communities, from companies. And we heard what's important to them. We heard about what's working, what they'd like to see more of. Also, some of the pain points and frustrations with either gaps in Clean BC from a delivery perspective, or where just the delivery was a little bit rocky and where there's room for improvement. And so what we did is we took those to inform a set of principles that reflect what we've heard and that served as a touchstone for us when we were thinking about what recommendations to make, and which we believe the government should similarly use as a touchstone when it's thinking about its next steps and making decisions, and then when it's moving forward on delivery of those. There are two principles that I want to put a bit of a spotlight on because they were so prevalent. The first is about protecting affordability. So as we know, a lot of British Columbians are feeling challenged right now with the cost of living. And so what we've done to do that is to really try to advance a package of recommendations that work together to help protect affordability, particularly for those who are most challenged. So for example, as Marin said, continuing to provide some incentives and rebate programs, continue to have those be income tested, because those are the folks who are going to benefit the most from the energy cost savings associated with those technologies. We also need utilities to focus even more on energy efficiency. The energy we don't use is energy we don't need to pay for. And then lastly, also enabling the BC Utilities Commission to consider low income or income-based rates, which is an approach we're seeing in a number of jurisdictions now. The other one is competitiveness. So of course, we do need to have a growing and prosperous economy. What we heard from business is that they recognize that they need to get to lower carbon products, that there is actually a demand from the market and there are demand for investors to head in that direction. And if we look at the top 10 countries after the United States that Canada trades with, they all have net zero commitments, climate policies, carbon pricing, or some are beginning to move with border carbon adjustments, where they actually impose a tariff based on how polluting the product is in its production. So for industry, they need a mix of carrots and sticks to encourage innovation, and then also to ensure deployment of the better technologies that are increasingly available.
So we're recommending 7 priorities for action. If you want a one-pager, this is it. If you want to get some detail written in the kind of language that normal people like me can understand, that's page 49, where we go through the 7. And if you really are a policy wonk, Appendix A is where we have the detailed 80 pieces of advice for the government. But Dan and I are going to go through these 7 priorities. We do apologize now that there were 85 programs and policies for us to review in this. So we'll go as quickly as we can, but there's a fair bit to cover in this. But one thing I want to note with this slide is numbers 1 to 5 are really about shifting the energy that we use. 85% of our emissions come from producing and using energy, and it's about the shift to cleaner energy, which in most cases is cleaner electricity, and how we can create an orderly transition for the province. Priorities 6 and 7 are about the process and advice to government and others about how to work with the regions to get this delivered.
So the first one is clean electricity and electrification. And this is our top priority for action, because it's not only key to reducing emissions, but it's fundamental to building a long-term competitive economy and to reducing energy bills for British Columbians. Clean electricity can underpin greater economic productivity, greater competitiveness. It enables our companies to produce lower carbon goods. And electrification of heating and transportation can cut energy bills for British Columbians and support affordability. We're fortunate to have BC Hydro, a Crown corporation that has a legacy of clean electricity. We have significant additional renewable energy potential, and BC Hydro is a very trusted brand amongst British Columbians. So we have the opportunity to really lean into electrification in BC in a way that's more challenging in other provinces and other jurisdictions. The process of growing and modernizing the electricity grid in the province is going to spur innovation. It's going to drive private sector investment. It's going to create jobs, and it's going to unlock new opportunities for First Nations partners who are participating in those projects. But to unlock this, we need to fill one of the gaps from Clean BC, and that is really sorting out, integrating, and optimizing across our electricity system and our gas utility system. That's one area where there has been ongoing uncertainty in terms of the respective roles of those two systems. We are going to need both of those systems. We are going to lean increasingly into electricity. We need to focus on cleaning up the gas system, but we are going to have both of those, and we need to make sure that they're optimized to protect ratepayers and to make sure that both of them are doing what they're best at. Oh, I think this is still me. All right, I'm only going to touch very briefly on this. If you want to go deeper into understanding the physics and economics and geopolitics of the energy transition, we've got a primer in Appendix F. But we just did want to highlight one of the key things about electrification is that when we use electricity, we can use it far more efficiently than when we're burning fossil fuels. So electric vehicles are a great example of that. If you go and you fill up your car at the gas station and you put $10 of gas into the car, about $8 of that is wasted as waste heat. $2 of that goes to getting you from point A to point B, getting your kids to hockey practice, getting yourself to work, what have you. With an electric car, you put $10 of electricity in, and $9 of that goes to getting you from point A to point B. So it's a dramatic shift in the efficiency, and that's what really drives down the fuel costs. So for those people that are adopting electric vehicles, they're saving thousands of dollars, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars per year. Increasingly, we are seeing in British Columbia, when we look at the data as to who's purchasing vehicles, we're seeing it moving up into those communities where it's commuters and where they really understand that they benefit the most because of the amount of driving they do from the lower costs associated with electric vehicles. Plug-in hybrids are a great option for those people who aren't necessarily quite ready to go to an electric vehicle. They may live rurally or remotely, or do longer trips where they might be concerned about access to charging. So plug-in hybrids are a great option because they have a gas motor backup that can recharge the battery as we're driving. The minister recently introduced some new regulatory changes that are going to provide more credits for plug-in hybrids under the zero emission vehicle regulations, which we're supportive of. And it's a good way to bridge people from a gas car through to an electric vehicle in the future.
Yeah, so our next priority action area is to make it easier for British Columbians to cut their energy bills and their climate pollution. And I guess I want to start by saying there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation that has been happening in this province across the country about these technologies. What we found fascinating through some of the focus group work that we did around the province is that people actually are much more aware, understand these, and want these technologies. Their frustrations because they can't afford them, because there's concerns about access to adequate electricity in their neighborhood, and things like that. So our advice is to actually help British Columbians get into these. And you'll probably want to know how we can pay for that in times of fiscal constraints. And so we put some thought into that as well. For example, BC Hydro currently gets credits for those who are plugging in their electric vehicle. The low carbon fuel standard generates credits, which can be monetized. And that's what we've used in the past for the incentives to support electrification of transportation. So those incentives can go towards charging. They can go towards e-bikes. They can go towards electric vehicles or upgrades for MURBs. But to use those, the revenues that are generated through that climate program, cycle it back into climate solutions. Equally, right now, to support the upgrades and efficiency to heating, home heating, to shift to heat pumps. There's a clean energy levy in place right now. We are suggesting that that get increased moderately and that those revenues would be generated back into those types of incentive programs. That would still leave British Columbians paying 20% less on their gas bills from when they paid the carbon tax. So in the affordability thing, we're very conscious of that and ensuring that what our advice is going to be taking into account affordability issues and supporting British Columbians. Another piece of our advice is that, you know, British Columbia is a big province. This picture you see here is the climate zones. And so one size doesn't fit all. And so we're proposing that some regulations around building codes be maintained for the island and for the lower mainland, and that those timelines get extended. They are on a longer time trajectory for regions outside in those colder climate zones. The same with the energy step code, that we take off the top level of step code, make it voluntary for people to address some affordability concerns. With the zero emission vehicle mandate, you know, we're suggesting calibrating it for the moment, getting rid of the ICE ban, the ban on gas vehicles in 2035, and reducing the goals for 2030. But we are very clear that we need to keep that made in British Columbia zero emission vehicle mandate. That has actually been very successful in ensuring that there's choice for those who want electric vehicles, and that there's makes and models here. And we also have some advice about trying to get new electric vehicles into the country that are more affordable. There's over 20 models that are sold in the EU that are $40,000 or less. And it would be good for Canada and British Columbians to have access to those as well. And I'd say that that's it. So there's lots of details in there on how to address the affordability issues and make sure that we don't have a one size fits all approach on some of these policies.
So there's a big opportunity to leverage BC's clean energy advantage, to leverage Clean BC, the policies, the programs, and the progress we're making to date to create more jobs throughout the energy transition. One of the things we heard from both the private sector as well as from labor is that there needs to be a more explicit and deliberate effort to ensure we're aligning workforce planning and training to make sure we have the workers when and where we need them and with the right skill sets. This was committed in Clean BC. Work was initiated, it was building up ahead of steam. The pandemic hit, made it a lot harder for the group working on that to come together. And it didn't get picked up again after that. And so that remains a gap. And so at this period of time where we are going to look at extending out beyond 2030, thinking about what the next decade looks like, it's an opportune time to make sure that we're looking at what are the jobs that are going to be created, where are they going to be created, and make sure that we've got the right training programs, the right number of seats in those programs so that we've got the workforce we need. We also heard about the importance of making sure that we've got a diverse and competitive economy long into the future. And right now we're benefiting from producing natural gas that generates royalties into government. That's a non-renewable resource. We get to produce it once. And so one of the themes that came out is that we should look to use some portion of that revenue to invest in economic diversification and competitiveness in the longer term. So we're recommending the establishment of a clean economy diversification fund using a portion of natural gas royalties. This was something that was in the NDP platform in last year's election, and it received a lot of support throughout the consultation process. BC also punches above its weight when it comes to clean tech and climate tech. The number of companies we have, many of them are started out of some of our university laboratories, beats every other province in the country. And that's something that we can lean into more in the province. These are the innovators and entrepreneurs that are responding to the market signals that are sent by Clean BC policies and regulations to deliver the solutions that industries need to reduce their emissions. So they have that opportunity to first serve that market here in British Columbia, but ultimately these are technologies and solutions that are needed worldwide. And so this is a sector that can grow not just by supporting BC efforts, but can sell into markets around the world. And then we also heard a lot from youth and about youth. And the Youth Climate Corps is a concept that was pioneered in BC. The federal government is now getting behind it as well and wanting to do something similar nationally. We're recommending to double down on that, to continue with that in the province with the Provincial Youth Climate Corps because of the benefits that it offers to British Columbia youth in terms of employment opportunities, the ability to give back to their communities, to feel empowered to be acting on climate and supporting their own health and well-being.
So you can see the theme of build on what's working. That's our advice for BC's industries and the regulations. So we have the industrial carbon price, which is in place, and we can use that tool. It needs to be extended out to later dates so that industry can plan and make investments against it. And also there's places where it could be tightened or strengthened, and we're encouraging the government to do that as well. That is one theme we heard over and over again from industry, was what they want is predictability and certainty so that they can plan their investments against policy. So the low carbon fuel standard, the industrial carbon price, and others, they are looking for those policies to continue in a way that they can make their investments and business plans. Methane, I mentioned it, there's the graph. Again, we're right now scheduled to be near zero emissions by 2035. We can move that up. Significantly, here is the net zero new industry. So this is one piece of advice, is that we're advising the government to not just have this on projects that trigger an environmental assessment, which is what it is right now, but to apply it to the upstream gas production and the pipelines, as there'll be significant new emissions there, and that's a way to help reduce emissions in the gas sector. And we're saying if government does all of these three things, then they don't need to proceed with the oil and gas emissions cap, which isn't in place right now, and you could achieve the better results in a more timely way by doing the three things above.
So as I said, electricity is going to play a bigger role in our energy system, but it's not going to be the only source of energy. We are still going to need both both liquid fuels as well as gases. And so we're recommending extending out the period of time for the low carbon fuel standard all the way out to 2040 and strengthening it, which will send the signal to continue to invest in producing biofuels. We've already got billions of liters being dropped into existing vehicles, whether those are freight trucks or even in your car. So there's an opportunity to make sure that the success that we've had with that policy can continue and strengthen into the future. We're also recommending introducing a renewable natural gas requirement for gas utilities that would make sure that we're increasing the proportion of renewable natural gas that's entering the gas system. There's an opportunity in both of these cases to prioritize domestic production. With renewable natural gas, that can be made from forestry waste streams, from agricultural waste streams, as well as from municipal solid waste. And so that can actually create value for other sectors as well, as at the same time that it's helping our gas utilities to lower the carbon intensity of the gas that they're putting into the system.
Yeah, and I should say that one of the biggest concerns or frustrations with Clean BC to date that we heard from many sectors was the lack of clean energy supply, whether it was lack of electricity, lack of adequate biofuels, renewable fuels. It was across the board. And so that is why we are really focusing on generating more clean energy supply. Of that 6 billion liters of biofuels, half of that was made in Canada. We've advised that we increase domestic production, and by extending the length of that policy, we could be creating more jobs here in BC and across the country as well. We had a lot of discussions with First Nations leaders, First Nations and others around the province, a lot of very positive impact. They are, of course, those living in their territories are really feeling the impacts of climate change on an annual basis. They're also very interested in all aspects of the solutions. And so our advice is for government to co-develop a process to align Clean BC implementation with the UN Declaration and DRIPA and continue that work. In addition, local governments are key partners in implementing this on the ground, and we encourage the government to continue with that.
So also on delivery, that was another thing that we heard quite consistently, is that a lot of things were delivered well, the government is working well, but there's more that can be done, in particular to drive effective delivery of Clean BC across multiple ministries. So it's housed in the Ministry of Energy and Climate Solutions, but there are multiple other ministries that have a direct role to play in implementing various policies and programs that are part of Clean BC and part of reducing emissions. So really enhancing that all of government Clean BC delivery, the coordination and effective delivery is key to success and key for those stakeholders, those companies on the outside that are often then having to engage with multiple ministries. They want to make sure that everybody's rowing in the same direction and is aware of what's going on. As we've mentioned multiple times, we are, of course, very cognizant of the current fiscal situation of the government. And so we've really tailored our advice to recognize that in terms of shifting away from necessarily spending as much to looking at what's the full toolbox that we have to reduce emissions. That said, as we've noted, we really do recommend that where there are revenues being generated from the industrial carbon price, credit revenues from the low carbon fuel standard, the clean energy levy, that those be transparently recycled into climate programs and climate solutions, and that be communicated to British Columbians. We think it would be a mistake to have those going into general revenue for the simple reason that British Columbians don't necessarily see the benefit in paying something extra if it's not going towards the solutions that they're seeking. When it comes to targets, there's been a lot of focus on targets. There's an annual report that comes out, the Climate Change Accountability Report, that focuses on modeled future looking out to 2030, what kind of progress we're making. There's been, in our view, too much emphasis on that target and on modeling, which is a best estimate as to whether we might be on track. We've both worked extensively with folks who undertake this modeling And what they always tell us is that models are always wrong and sometimes useful. And so I think we overemphasize these models and their ability to predict the future, when in fact we should be looking at a much broader set of indicators that can illustrate that we are making progress, moving down the path towards reducing emissions, and indicators that are actually far more tangible to British Columbians. We talk to British Columbians about reducing emissions X% by Y date relative to Z baseline year. Their eyes glaze over. They don't really understand what that means. If we talk about how many electric vehicles we're getting on the road, how much are people saving from driving those electric vehicles? How many heat pumps are we installing and replacing natural gas? How much are those folks saving on their bills? How many jobs are being created in the clean economy? How much is being invested in those new opportunities? Those are much more tangible to people, and they're much better measurable progress indicators of what we're achieving to date. The greenhouse gas emissions inventory is always several years behind. It's a big process to try to document those emissions. And emission reductions are often a lagging indicator of the progress in the real world. It takes time to make those investments, turn over capital stock. And so the emission reductions, when we look at some of the modeling and we actually look out beyond 2030, what we see is many of the policies and programs in place today, they really begin to deliver more significant emission reductions in the 2030 to 2040 period. And yet we've had this emphasis on the 2030 targets. So we believe that targets do play a role. They should be ambitious, they should be achievable, but they should be informed by both that top-down analysis of what would it take to try to achieve a target that we aspire to, and that should then be ground truth with bottom-up analysis of, do we have the clean energy supply? Do we have the workforce? Do we have the capital? Are we bringing British Columbians along? And those targets then can be calibrated to be true accountability measures where they are tied to what we are actually doing, as opposed to an aspirational target.
Okay, and we're almost near the end, and we'll create a chance for questions for everyone. So LNG, a bit of an elephant in the room, not clearly discussed in the first Clean BC, and our evaluation of it, we've got a graph. New LNG, it's proposing jobs and economic development for BC. We've outlined some of the risks that we heard about and that we see, which is the scale of the LNG being proposed and the upstream production is going to create some economic risks. There is only so much electricity. There is only so big of a labor force, and there's only so much time that governments have to work on policy and support programs. So there's an opportunity cost for some of the other economic interests that are at play in the province. We looked at the long-term prospects. You can see it outlined in the report. There's a lot of uncertainty around a decade from now, what the markets are going to be, and we've outlined that. There's no certainty that BC's LNG is going to lead to global emissions from some other country reducing their emissions by using it. There's no studies that can demonstrate that actually will happen. And there was talk about getting credits, Article 6. That's really seems to be, hasn't proven to come to bear. So this was a bit beyond our mandate here. And we looked at it, we see opportunity costs, and our advice to the government is that they need to actually create some system, something like a citizens' assembly on a sustainable economy in British Columbia. And, we encourage them to dig into that, and a lot of those issues could be addressed there. And I outlined before how to manage the pollution intensity from natural gas and the LNG plants in the previous slide.
So I think another key point, another thing that we heard loud and clear is that we need to change the way that we talk about climate and Clean BC in the province. Again, it has been too target-centric and emissions-focused, when in fact, this is actually about building a better and stronger BC. The story of Clean BC is about affordability and good jobs. It's about healthy communities, economic competitives, and climate progress. There are co-benefits that British Columbians experience in their daily lives associated with policies and programs in Clean BC. There are economic benefits for the industries we have today and for the industries of tomorrow. And then, of course, there are the climate benefits. And we have been making progress in reducing emissions per capita, per unit of GDP, and on an absolute basis. And what the science ultimately tells us on climate change is that every ton of pollution matters. And so we do need to just keep moving forward with our best efforts to reduce as many tons as we can.
So to wrap, our advice, show me, don't tell me. British Columbians are looking for action. They really are looking for the government to lead. We don't need to have big promises of some new climate plan. We need to actually just do what we're doing right now and make it more effective as outlined. Move forward with speed and purpose. I think we got a lot of feedback about the on again, off again, the lack of clarity about where this policy is going. The business sector, communities, citizens are looking for the government to set a clear direction. And our advice is to really engage with BC Hydro and the BCUC. These are pieces of the puzzle that need to be helping to solve problems and move us forward, both on the affordability and on energy planning. We also see that this crossed all ministries, really pretty much all ministries, and we need an all of government approach to delivering this. And we've given advice around having things back with some sort of center in the Premier's office, or other approaches. And then, let's talk about progress and indicators. And Appendix H, I think it is, no, B now. Appendix B has a list of the types of indicators that citizens can relate to, things like the number of heat pumps that are being installed in the megawatts of electricity that we've expanded, the number of jobs that we have in some of these new sectors, the number of EV chargers that are now in place. These are the kinds of indicators that make sense to people rather than just talking about targets in years and GHG emissions.
That's it. So we'd welcome questions.
Great. Thank you. A reminder to reporters on the line, if you'd like to ask a question of the reviewers, Maren Smith or Dan, please take yourself off of speakerphone or Bluetooth, then press *1 to enter the queue. You'll be limited to one question and one follow-up. We'll start with questions here in the room. And our first question goes to Alec Lazenby, Vancouver Sun.
Hi there. Thank you so much for doing this. I just wanted to ask you both. You talk a lot about, how LNG will create new jobs, provide economic benefit, and that the revenues that are, created through that can go back into climate solutions. At the same time, you also talk about how much it will add to the province's emissions. Looking through the report, I don't see a section that really does fully square how LNG fits into the climate plan here. So just wondering if you could talk a bit about that in terms of a lot of these targets. I know they're changed, they're readjusted, but can BC meet any of these targets with the new projects that are coming online?
So I think the math of emissions associated with new LNG is inescapable. Emissions would go up in that sector at the same time that we're making progress in reducing emissions in other sectors. And that means the sum total of that is emissions province-wide would not be going down to the same extent or could be actually going up. The decisions around LNG are really economic decisions that have a climate dimension to them. And so we've made recommendations in terms of how emissions from LNG can be minimized. So things like making the methane regulations even more stringent, continuing with the industrial carbon price, the net zero for new industry requirements, not just applying to the LNG terminals, but also to the pipelines and to the upstream. So there's an opportunity to manage those emissions as best as possible. But ultimately, and this is why we've recommended that there needs to be a broader discussion about what does the province's economic future look like? What is the balance between different sectors and different opportunities? We have a lot of other opportunities, for example, in critical minerals. One of the big drivers for development of critical minerals is that they are needed for clean energy technologies, things like electric vehicle batteries, solar panels, wind turbines. That's what's driving capital into the mining sector right now. And so there's a long-term opportunity associated with that. Everything that we see happening worldwide is that those technologies are taking off. Those are going to become the dominant technologies. So there's long-term operating opportunity associated with mining. With LNG, how long we might have that opportunity is far more uncertain. And so that's why we highlight some of the potential opportunity costs if we don't have a balanced approach across the economy and across these different opportunities. And then, of course, whatever decisions are made about what we want to lean into from an economic perspective, we need to do everything we can to manage greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's why we've made specific policy recommendations to do that.
And then
Follow up, Alec?
Yes, in terms of a follow-up, I want to ask about the EV targets that were recently, they're going to be changed. And you also talk a lot in the report about public transit and the need to build that up. A lot of rural, remote, and northern communities don't have public transit. They don't have the same charging infrastructure for EVs that, say, Lower Mainland has, Southern Vancouver Island has. Just wondering your thoughts on how feasible it is to build up that infrastructure, to build up the transit in these communities, to build up the charging stations, because in a lot of cases that's the reason for the lack of uptake, is the fact that it's just not feasible in a lot of these communities.
So electric vehicles right now don't necessarily work in all parts of the province for all people, just based on their driving habits or based on the availability of charging infrastructure. And transit opportunities are not the same everywhere. And as we've said, one size doesn't fit all in terms of how we approach Clean BC. There need to be different approaches in different areas. For those people who drive more or may not have access to charging, plug-in hybrids, which are permitted under the Zero Emission Vehicle Act, do contribute towards compliance for automakers, are a good solution there. But this is also where it's important that we have something like the low carbon fuel standard, which is producing cleaner, lower carbon fuels that are just dropped into the supply. We don't need to change our vehicles. So that can reduce the emissions intensity associated with those vehicles. One of the things we've identified with transit is the province has been supporting transit long before we had Clean BC, and for the very real reasons that there are multiple benefits. It reduces traffic congestion, it enhances productivity, it's more affordable for many people. And so we believe that there needs to be sustainable funding for public transit. We need to continue to invest in public transit, but that shouldn't be done just through the lens of emission reduction, because there are so many other reasons why that needs to be funded, and it shouldn't just be thought of as climate funding.
Next question goes to Emily Fagan, CBC.
Thank you. So, excuse me, you've been talking about how kind of the decision to invest in expanding LNG is a bit of an economic move. I'm curious, is there not also an expected economic toll of not acting quick enough, not going far enough with reducing emissions? And how did you kind of balance that in kind of making these recommendations?
So you're going to enjoy Appendix A, where we get into a lot more detailed recommendations than what we've necessarily spoken to. We have identified that there is a need in the government's fiscal planning to better account for the climate impacts that we are experiencing and that are having an impact on our economy. They're having an impact on government spending in terms of how government needs to respond and support people from that. We've also suggested that when making decisions, we should consider what is the cost associated with these incremental emissions and actually put a dollar figure on that. So the federal government, many other governments use something, it's called the social cost of carbon, which is integrated into their financial planning and into their assessment of different opportunities before them. And it begins to acknowledge that there is a cost of carbon emissions, there is a cost of climate change that should factor into government decisions when they're making policy, when they're creating a budget. And so that can bring some more balance and make sure that we're working with an accurate balance sheet in terms of the costs and benefits associated with different economic opportunities in the province.
So kind of going off of that, I guess, like, did you cost out, like how much going into LNG might cost us as well as benefit us?
No, that was beyond the scope of what we could do in terms of making assumptions about what would or wouldn't happen in terms of LNG production and where the gas is coming from and how it's used.
Next question comes
I-
from,
I think we would say that work needs to be done. Like right now, British Columbia, understandably, things like LNG plants, mines, they take a process before they actually make a final investment decision that they're going to land here. So there's a lot of balls up in the air, but we're saying BC should actually play a much more active role in terms of what it is wanting to invest in and what it's wanting to land in British Columbia. We see other jurisdictions doing this, and building out electricity like they're doing right now is a good step. You cannot overbuild electricity at this moment in time. There is such a demand for clean electricity. You know, the mining sector is counting on that North Coast transmission line, you know, as are the LNG plants. So at some point, the government's going to need to face some decisions. And, you know, that's probably a conversation that British Columbians want to be in. We know that British Columbians want to be engaged in that, having done this survey, having done this work.
next question comes from Rob Buffum, CTV.
Oh, hi. Thanks for taking my question. I just wanted to get your reaction. The BC Greens have issued a release and they've expressed disappointment that the review is not more critical of LNG. I want to get your reaction to that.
I think one of our reflections through this is that, as is often the case, particularly in politics, we can often center in on a single issue or a single sector. Clean BC, BC's economy, BC's sources of emissions are much broader. And so we've looked at the full scope of it and really focused our recommendations on what are the actionable next steps that we can continue to take to reduce emissions in the province across all sectors? How can we support British Columbians in experiencing the full range of benefits associated with doing that? You know, we live in an era of trade-offs, and the context has shifted significantly from when Clean BC was first developed. And so we do need to strike the right balance. And I think for us, the focus has been on, let's make sure that we build on our experience and success to date. Let's extend and strengthen those things that are working. Let's support British Columbians to take steps to reduce emissions, but also benefit from things like lower energy bills. And how can we make all of our industries as clean as possible, which will make them more competitive? And that includes LNG. As Marin said, as to the future of the LNG sector and how much it grows, that's not a conversation that we think should happen or can happen just within the context of climate change. There are a lot of other considerations that need to be taken into account and that go beyond the scope of our review.
Follow up? Oh, go ahead.
I think it's also important to note that a lot has changed since 2018. I think, you know, some of you would have been in the room when the Clean BC plan was first announced. The technologies we were talking about then, the word heat pump is barely in Clean BC, the original Clean BC. It is there, but it is not something that probably any of you were talking about at the time. Now, more people are installing heat pumps and gas furnaces. Like, this is quite a shift. There is a lot of opportunities to make gains, to reduce emissions, and make life more affordable for British Columbians than there were last time that we were discussing this. And we really want to focus on that. We want to focus on, you know, some of the actions that we can take that not only are going to reduce emissions, but they're going to actually make life better for citizens. They're going to create jobs here in British Columbia, or they're going to attract investments. And that's why we do a lot of focus on electricity. And we do encourage you to dive into that because there's a lot of depth and a lot of details in how we can actually take BC Hydro and make it really part of our economic strategy and our strength. And we're lucky in British Columbia that we have a Crown utility that can do that.
By way of follow-up, I just wanted, apologies if it was in a slide that I missed, but in terms of EV mandates, is there a specific recommendation for those targets, and can you articulate that?
Yeah, so we believe that that's been a successful policy in part because it's had complementary policies and programs. So investments in EV charging, making it easier for homes and businesses to install chargers, EV incentives that have helped reduce the purchase price. So that package of policies has, in our view, been very successful, and so needs to be extended out into the future. At the same time, we believe that we need to calibrate targets to what we think the market can sustain and the market can achieve. We think that it is important to have made in BC targets for zero emission vehicles, reflecting the opportunities and the benefits for British Columbians. British Columbians have benefited from the zero emission vehicle mandate insofar as it's actually driven automakers to offer models in BC before they offer them elsewhere. So we're often getting more choice in the marketplace. There's more competition in the marketplace between different automakers, which helps to reduce the prices. So it is important for us to have this policy. We're recommending a range of between 50 and 60% for 2030 and 90% in 2035. We're recommending that the ban on internal combustion engines, which is currently slated for 2035, is unnecessary. We can take it to 90% in 2035, and frankly, at that point, let the market take it the distance from there, while still, for those more exceptional cases where there might be a gas vehicle needed, that option would still exist.
And I just want to add that there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation that's circulating in BC about things like, for example, EVs and electricity, and that, that's part of the problem in terms of the concerns around these things. And we encourage people to really tackle some of that and ensure that that misinformation doesn't continue. But one thing I just wanted to point out on the upside, Dan mentioned it, but EVs are often considered toys of the rich. And for sure, West Vancouver, Richmond were the highest uptake. If you analyze by postal codes for many years, what we found very exciting was that now we have those same levels of uptake in places like Delta and Surrey. We also went through the EV rebates that have been provided. They have been redirected to low-income families. 100% of them are going to low-income families. So we're seeing a real shift in the uptake where people who are commuters are now the ones benefiting and purchasing these. And I'd say that's the exciting transition that's going to create more affordability for a more diverse population.
Question from Rob Shaw, Check News.
This is mainly for Marin, I think. As someone who was in the room for the launch of Clean BC, before Clean BC, remembering you very specifically asking government to legislate GHG reduction targets, saying that it was going to be a system that holds government's feet to the fire, endorsing that for quite a long time. I'm struggling to, or I guess I'm hoping you can reflect on that. That has got you here today saying, well, those targets are lagging indicators and we don't, they don't mean anything to the public. They seemed core to what you wanted government to do from the beginning, which is targets that reflected international spectrum of goals based on a year, legislated into law. And now you're saying we need something more realistic. And I guess I just want you to reflect on that so I can take 7 years of your comments and kind of chart them, because they feel very different today.
Yeah, that's a great question, Rob. So back in, if you think of the 2015, a lot of countries and jurisdictions had climate policy. That one, We were supposed to have a cap on the gas utility emission. We don't have one. So if we don't put in place policies, we aren't going to meet targets. That's part of why we're recommending. We aren't recommending a number for a target, you'll notice. And that's because we're saying, government, you have to decide what you're going to do and then build the target from the bottom up. You can't, pick a number. It's like saying, I'm going to go on a in place the plan to do it, or only doing half of what you said you were going to do. Of course, you're not going to make it. So we want to actually make that more transparent to people. Picking a number and not taking the actions is not working. And that's why you can hear our advice today is all about actually doing the actions. And secondly, I think what we found is those targets weren't meaningful to the public. They don't understand them. I mean, who understands, as Dan riffed off, 30% reduction below 2005 levels of X percentage of GHGs. It's meaningless to people. And so since people are experiencing climate change now and British Columbians are experiencing across the board, we need to talk to them. They're being disempowered in part because they don't know what's working, what's not. They don't know where progress is happening and where it's not. And we're saying we need to make that much more transparent to people. We need to use indicators that they can relate to. Here's our transportation emissions. How do we reduce it? We get more biofuels. If we're at, whatever I said, 4 billion or 6 billion liters, are we going for 7 billion liters by 20 whatever? And they're also interested in understanding more, how does it relate to their community and what are the benefits for their community? So we're encouraging the government to be much clearer about what they are going to do, and we're encouraging a way that citizens can get more engaged.
It feels like when we set the targets based on GHG emissions, it was part about actually reducing climate pollution globally, preventing the increase in temperature rising, saving the world was the idea, right? Like we were reducing pollution for the world using a benchmark. And now you're suggesting benchmarks that are so local, we could put in more EV charging stations and still watch the world burn, right? Like you're changing the benchmarks to be so local that they don't achieve the global goal of reducing pollution, I guess would be the shift that I see in what you're saying. And that the argument about cutting greenhouse gas emissions is now so complicated and difficult for the public to understand after 7 years of trying to explain it to them. We're just going to move away from it and start measuring things that might not actually reduce pollution in the way we've been arguing needs to be reduced for years. Is that fair?
Can I take a crack?
Oh, sure, you take a crack. And
I mean, this is something we've thought about a lot, and we've both worked in this field for decades. And I think what we're seeing a shift from, not just in British Columbia and the work we're doing, but everywhere, is to really actually focus now more on the action and the investments and the doing things. Whereas 7, 8, 10 years ago, this was all about setting targets, and then it was about creating plans. And BC had an award-winning climate plan. But the proof is in the pudding in delivery and actually reducing emissions. And as we've documented, and as the Climate Change Accountability Report shows, we are having success in that, just not as much as we aspired to. And that aspiration, of course, was tied to a very ambitious global target in terms of doing our best to minimize the extent of climate change. But as we said, the science is that every ton matters. We all need to be doing as much as we can, as fast as we can. And I think what the government has learned, what everybody has learned, is that that happens within a certain context and certain constraints. And so since Clean BC was developed, we've been through a global pandemic. We've been through very significant affordability challenges. We had Russia invade Ukraine and spike oil and gas prices, which really compounded that affordability challenge. At the same time, we have seen incredible progress in the development and deployment of the technologies that we need, not just here, but around the world. For every dollar that's invested in oil and gas and coal development globally, $2 are invested in clean energy technologies and their deployment. This year globally, 1 in 4 cars that are sold will be electric vehicles. On the actual on-the-ground transition of our energy system, how we produce it and how we consume it, there has been incredible progress and there's incredible momentum. We did lose several years, but now we have so many of those solutions at hand. We need to focus on delivery. And then over time, what we expect is that, and what we have been seeing globally, is that delivery is actually exceeding expectations. And so then let's increase our ambition as we build momentum, as we have success, and that's actually key to building and sustaining public support. Right now, they see an annual report that comes out and says, we're not on track to meet our targets. We're failing at the same time that they are experiencing climate change and the loss of lives and livelihoods that comes with that, the health impacts that come with that. So it's important right now for us to actually shift away from that to actually say, let's look at all the progress that we're making. Let's continue to have the policies and programs that are enabling that progress. Let's celebrate that. Let's build on that, and let's increase ambition over time, because we do need to do more than what we're currently on track to do. But we need to build momentum for that, as opposed to having a system where it's the beatings will continue until morale improves. If the message is constantly that we're not doing enough, that we're failing, that just deflates everybody, right?
We haven't reduced GHG. Like, isn't that a failure?
So we are reducing emissions, and we're
the 2007 level. We haven't reduced them in BC.
But Rob, we've reduced emissions here. We've reduced emissions per capita. We've reduced emissions per unit of GDP. So we've actually decoupled our economy from emissions reductions, which is a good thing. It means we're able to reduce emissions and grow the economy. You know, our population has grown. Are we reducing them as fast as we should? Absolutely not. So don't walk away from here thinking that everything's rosy. We are not doing enough. We need to, you know, strengthen those policies that we've talked about. We need to add in the new policies that we're recommending. We need to take more action, 100%. But do I think that telling people, okay, you know, transportation is 25% of our GHG emissions in British Columbia, and, you know, we're going to reduce the emissions by X%, you know, you're a communicator. That speaks to very few people. In fact, we did the focus groups, and emissions targets are not relevant to them. But if you tell them X% of our car population is now electrified, our trucks, that's the next thing to tackle. And, you know, we encourage you to look. We're suggesting that things like delivery vans, those small delivery vans that are driving around, and which there are electric models available for, those are the next thing to be shifted to electric. You know, we're seeing electric buses on the streets here today. So step by step, and let's actually quantify where we're trying to get, because that's where the emissions reductions come from. That's what people can relate to. And you can have a, here's where we're going and where are we on the bar chart to get to that place. So I would say it's just a different way of looking at it. It's not a backing away from reducing emissions. It's actually looking at what are the tangible things that reduce the emissions, and let's start counting them. You know, methane emissions might be one that I would count, you know, in and of itself, because there's certain things that there isn't a technology necessarily.
Okay, question from Wolfgang Deppner, Canadian Press.
Yeah, hi, good morning. Thank you for taking my question. And I'm going to continue sort of Rob's line of questioning here a little bit. And please don't take this the wrong way. But I haven't read the report, so I'm going to sort of preface that. But based on just on your presentation, I can point to multiple cases of what one would call cognitive dissonance. And I just want to cherry pick 2 of them. Number one, you say that British Columbians need to use energy more efficient, yet your report says that future buildings, that the highest building efficiency level should be voluntary. Number 2, you talk about the importance of getting more EV vehicles from Europe into British Columbia. And that, of course, depends on trade. Your presentation also points out that a number of jurisdictions, including the European Union, is going to impose penalties on countries, on jurisdictions that don't have a carbon tax. So how do you reconcile getting more EV vehicles from Europe into British Columbia, when the absence of a carbon tax in British Columbia will make it more difficult to trade. So, and I can point to any number of other examples, but I was hoping that you can comment on sort of this level of cognitive dissonance that runs through your report. Thank you.
Do you want to take the first one? I'll take the second.
No, you go ahead. The step code.
So on efficiency and the energy step code, we looked at it through the lens of a cost benefit analysis in terms of the extra cost of building a new home, a new building to achieve that highest level of the energy step code doesn't actually pay off through the efficiency savings. And so from a cost benefit analysis perspective, it doesn't actually make sense to do that. Yes, it's more efficient, but not in a way that's actually going to help people save money in the long run because of that higher upfront cost. The energy step code also works in conjunction with the zero carbon step code, which is focused on emissions. That highest step of the energy step code also doesn't deliver any significant additional emissions benefit at that highest step. So that was the recommendation for that. So happy to speak with you further on that in terms of the details on that. In terms of trade and electric vehicles, it's a matter for the federal government. I know we've heard the minister suggesting that having access to Chinese vehicles or having access to other vehicles made in Japan or Korea or Europe that are made to international safety standards should be made available in North America. In North America, largely to protect the North American auto sector, there are safety standards that need to be met, and so that those producers in other countries would have to have a dedicated assembly line in order to export into North America. From the perspective of many experts, if a vehicle is safe enough for the Autobahn and for roads in Europe and everywhere else, it's safe enough for Canada, and we shouldn't be trying to protect the North American sector through those safety standards. In Europe, there are 20 models of electric vehicles that are available for under $40,000. In Canada, there's one. And right now, those models can't be exported because they meet that international safety standard, not the North American safety standard. So we've been encouraging the federal government, I think the minister has as well, to take a more pragmatic approach to making sure that Canadians have more choice in the EV market and access to more affordable EVs. With respect to the European Union's border carbon tax that they're proposing to impose, we do still have an industrial price on pollution in BC and one nationally. And the focus of the European border carbon adjustment is on industrial projects and industrial pricing. So in fact, we are going to have preferential access to the European market relative to the Americans or relative to many other jurisdictions that haven't continued with or don't have a price on industrial pollution.
And
just to say that, just to make sure that we aren't coming across as anti-Canadian, currently right now, 90% of the cars purchased by Canadians are not made in Canada. So the Canadian auto sector is manufacturing cars that go predominantly to the US.
And as a follow-up, again, I hope I understood you correctly. You're premising the departure from these global emission targets on the idea, and again, I'm just make sure I heard you correctly, is that people don't understand them. They don't understand a minus 40% reduction in GHGs and so on, right? But square that with me with this idea that somehow you're going to present to the public any number of other metrics. You're just going to bombard them with metrics about how many EV vehicles we have now, how many jobs we have related to this, how many things we have related to this issue. Isn't a one global figure more sort of easier to absorb than sort of bombarding the public, flooding the zone, if you wish, with a number of statistics and metrics that if people can't follow one metric, how are they supposed to follow 10 metrics? Thank you.
So to be clear, we're not suggesting that BC shouldn't have a greenhouse gas emissions reduction target. We're simply suggesting a different approach to actually establishing it, one that's premised upon our energy system and our economy as it is, and as we think it can transform with policies and programs that are going to be put in place. And so there would still be an emissions target and there would be accountability for that. And we would understand how that does exist within our national targets and a global target. Already, we have different targets in different countries based on different responsibilities and different opportunities and ambitions. So it's not as though there's a single universal climate target that all jurisdictions are following. For example, even between British Columbia and the federal government, they use different baseline years. BC uses 2007, the federal government uses 2005. We're recommending that actually be reconciled, and we just have the 2005 baseline. But what we heard from British Columbians is it's not that they're not interested in targets or don't think we should have them, or they do understand we have to reduce emissions. They understand that there's science that we need to achieve a certain amount by a certain date. But at the same time, what they're really interested in is doing things to reduce emissions. And so they would far rather that we have an ambitious but achievable target with clear plans and policies and programs that are in place, and that we are measuring progress and holding our elected officials to account for the things they're actually doing, as opposed to having an aspirational target and a hypothetical plan to meet it with no real intention or ability to actually fully execute it.
Next question comes from Mark Page.
EV rebates. What do you think? Go for it.
We think that for this moment in time, they're necessary. We encourage the government to create a predictable schedule for those EV rebates. They can go down over the next few years. But what both consumers and the auto dealerships need is clarity. What is the rebate? And we would recommend that, by about 3, 4, 5 years from now, there's going to be cost parity. If we start allowing these greater number of models into British Columbia, we will get there sooner. And so these rebates aren't forever, but they're required. 100% they should be focused on low-income families. And then we've outlined the revenue stream, which is to go back to what we did before, which was take the low carbon fuel standard credits that BC Hydro generates. So for those of you who don't understand this, and I will admit I didn't understand this actually before we started this review, that every time somebody who has an EV plugs in their car to charge it up at home, that BC Hydro can tell because of the bump, and those are now turned into credits from the low carbon fuel, because that electricity is counted as low carbon fuel. So BC Hydro gets this little bank account over there from their low carbon fuel credits. It's not on the BC budget. It's over there at BC Hydro. It used to be recycled back into support electrification of transportation, either the rebates or charging infrastructure, etc. And we're suggesting we go back to that and do it transparently.
And maybe you could just explain, how well do you understand, what the impact on emissions of policy decisions is? How can you quantify that? X tons of carbon happen because of Y decision. And, specifically, maybe you could talk about the example of the removal of the consumer carbon tax. And how much did that cause another, 4 million tons of carbon emissions? I don't know if that's a relevant number or not, but what was the impact of that?
So unfortunately, particularly for something like that, it's really hard to, so when we've got these models that are projecting into the future, what's happening in the economy, and then what's happening with emissions, it's premised on a lot of different assumptions, and the models are not developed around specific policies. And so it's very hard to disaggregate and to understand what a policy is uniquely contributing to, in part because there's also a lot of policy overlap, right? So with the carbon tax, that increased the price of gasoline. What impact did that have on motivating somebody to buy an electric vehicle versus the EV incentive making it easier for somebody to buy an electric vehicle? So how would you attribute the emission reduction associated with that person buying an EV? Does it go to the carbon tax? Does it go to the EV rebate? Does it go to the zero emission vehicle mandate? Does it go to the charging infrastructure? So it's very hard in that sense, especially with something like the carbon tax, which is meant to shift behavior, to disentangle and understand what impact it would have. There are some types of policies like the methane regulations or like the low carbon fuel standard, where we can track in terms of the fuel stock that we've got less diesel being consumed and more biodiesel being consumed, and we know the difference in greenhouse gas intensity between the two. So sometimes with things like that that are more technology or energy specific, we can estimate what the reductions are. But with the carbon tax and pricing in particular, because it was intended to be a behavioral signal, incentivize people to look for lower carbon options, it's really hard to estimate what exactly that was going to contribute to. I think what we can say is that the removal of the consumer carbon tax did send a signal to the market by reducing the price of fossil fuels relative to what they were with the carbon tax that doesn't send that signal. And so people are more likely to continue to consume those fossil fuels. And so emissions would be higher. But to be able to, with any degree of accuracy, put a number on that, that's not something that's readily done.
So maybe I can just add to that, and it links back to Rob's question and the other gentleman about targets is really, you know, so what we're saying, I'm glad that Dan clarified, we are not saying get rid of targets. Absolutely keep those targets. That is the goal. And we, you know, are suggesting that we actually legislate the net zero by 2050. But it's a both and. It's that we need not just the targets, but we need indicators that we are making progress on the policies. There's been way too much debate about targets and like these models as that are hypothetical, whereas we can actually, in 2025 and going forward, we can actually get real and count things. The policies were to drive change. We can quantify the change now, and that's what we're advising. We're also advising that the Climate Solutions Council get modified and become an expert panel, and that it take over the accountability reporting on an annual basis, so that that get done outside of government, so that for the questions about how, you know, for the public that want to understand the targets and you know, the emissions and are we on track, that would be available. It would be available annually or every second year by an independent body that would, we you know, feel that that could create a credible source of the information for the public.
Okay, we still have a number of questions, so we're hoping we can get to everyone before we wrap. The next one is from Amelia Macauer, Radio Canada.
Thank you for taking my question. I'm right here. So I wanted to talk more about BC Hydro. I know you have a lot of focus on that. If BC Hydro were to, I guess, nourish all of the LNG projects that we have, it would be almost 8 times the equivalent of Site C. And I think that it's your report that says that it would be almost 60% of what BC Hydro could offer in terms of electricity in 2030. So I was wondering, is there anything that you recommend to the government to kind of scale up BC Hydro's production of electricity? I know it's a concern of other parties like the Conservative Party for the transmission line, saying that we don't have enough electricity to fuel that transmission line. So yeah.
So BC definitely has the potential to rapidly and significantly increase our electricity supply. We're very fortunate to have an abundance of a diversity of renewable energy sources. We all are also encouraging the government to look undertake a review looking at a variety of energy sources that aren't being produced today. There have been some who have really said we need to look at nuclear. We're saying take a look at nuclear, geothermal. Take a look at that. So there are even more resources beyond wind, solar, hydro that we think could tap into. But even with the wind, solar, and hydro resources we have, there is the potential to significantly scale that up. One of the challenges is that under the current regulatory framework, BC Hydro is incentivized to be very conservative in terms of projecting what demand is going to be and then building for it. And so we've made several recommendations for some regulatory reform that would allow BC Hydro to move forward more confidently and more proactively, so we can break the cycle of thinking we could have too much, so we're going to plan for less, but then it does materialize and we're playing catch up, which is what we experienced with the last BC Hydro Integrated Resource Plan, which led to, I was involved in a government committee looking at BC Hydro and how it could begin to shift its planning. Some changes have been made, but we believe there are more that need to be made to enable BC Hydro to do that. The government had made a commitment to there being new calls for power from BC Hydro every 2 years, which sends a signal to those wind and solar developers, to First Nations that want to participate, that there is that market opportunity extended over time. But then in BC Hydro's integrated resource plan filed just a few weeks ago, they say after this current call for power that's in the field right now, they don't think they need more. But again, that's because they are bound by these very conservative planning principles. But that sends mixed messages to the market as well. So there's more that needs to be done by government in setting policy direction, in making some regulatory changes with the BC Utilities Commission, and then directing BC Hydro to fully capitalize on the opportunity, as Marin said, and as BC Hydro even acknowledges in their integrated resource plan. The risk of building too much too quickly is actually very low. There's greater risk in not having enough electricity. But at the same time, right now, they are constrained in terms of what they can plan for. And so that needs to be fixed.
And I was wondering, BC also is focusing on hydrogen, or at least more clean hydrogen to be precise. And I was wondering, with your expertise, is that part also of the strategy to reduce our emissions?
So I think over the past several decades, we've seen what analysts kind of call these hydrogen hype cycles. And hydrogen is really interesting in that it can be used in a lot of different ways. Some people say it's kind of like a Swiss Army knife. It is kind of like a Swiss Army knife in that it can do a lot of different things, but like a Swiss Army knife, it doesn't necessarily do those things particularly well relative to some of the other energy sources. And so we're now kind of on the downside of the most recent hydrogen hype cycle, where when we actually get down to brass tacks in terms of what role can it play, there is a role for it, undoubtedly. It is used in various industrial applications. It can be used perhaps for high temperature heat in industrial applications, perhaps for heavy duty trucks, particularly for traveling longer distances. It could play a role. But in terms of, there's been discussion about blending it into the utility gas system. So it would be going into people's furnaces and gas stoves. We cite several studies, and the peer-reviewed literature is almost unanimous that use, putting it into the home heating system, is absolutely not a solution pathway. So it does have a role to play. I think it's far smaller than was envisioned in the province's hydrogen strategy. And so we now need to course correct and calibrate to that. So yes, it has a role. It's important, but it's not going to be as significant as perhaps some people once thought.
Now we have a question from Shannon Waters in Narwhal.
Hi, I'm curious about this chapter on LNG. You mentioned that it was sort of outside the scope of this review. This government has made very clear that LNG is a priority for them. The premier has even suggested that he would welcome more LNG facilities than what is already in the works. So I guess I'm curious why you included sort of this chapter in the review and what you're hoping for by putting it in there.
So it's not that LNG was beyond scope. BC's economy and BC's economic priorities and this government's economic priorities, doing a review of that was beyond the scope. Reviewing the greenhouse gas emissions from LNG today and into the future, the implications of those was within the scope of our review. And so that's why we have made recommendations in terms of how emissions from LNG and the upstream gas production could be minimized. But in terms of the ultimate scale of LNG that happens, that is an economic decision unless the government were to use climate policy to try to constrain that. And I think, though, what we've seen in terms of the public and political discourse is that using climate policy to deliberately try to constrain something is then leads to the backlash and the polarization, and then climate action is perceived as the thing that is going to prevent all of these opportunities. I think it's an economic decision with climate implications that need to be considered. Within that consideration, we wanted to provide our perspective on the prospects for LNG globally, in part because at the same time we see an energy transition happening in British Columbia, it's happening globally. In some places, it's actually happening even faster, including some of the markets that we're hoping to export LNG. So we need to have eyes wide open in terms of the long-term prospects for LNG and how those might be challenged by trends that we're seeing in the market. and especially then relating that back to certain opportunity costs. And I'll use electricity as the specific example, because electricity plays such an important role in supporting economic development, but also supporting electrification that reduces emissions. And so we've made recommendations on a priority list of how electricity should be allocated. And we've said the first priority should be supporting fuel switching and electrification in existing homes, buildings, the transportation system, and industries. Secondly, we should be using it for economic development. And yes, we should consider what is the scale of the economic opportunity and benefit in jobs created, in investment, in revenues to government. But we should also, as part of that, when we're then looking across a variety of sectors, we should say, what is the likely longevity of this sector? Is it at risk in a world that is shifting towards lower carbon? And if so, you may make some different choices about which of those sectors you prioritize for receiving electricity.
Okay, follow up, Shannon?
Yeah, I was thinking about 2018 and when the original Clean BC plan was launched, and there was a phrase that I have quoted many times over the years in the government talking about this plan, and that was world leading, that it was a world leading climate plan, that it really put BC on the cutting edge of things like emissions reduction, climate action, that kind of thing. So having gone over the plan in detail recently and making a bunch of recommendations about how we should move forward, does BC still have a world leading climate plan in 2025?
Go first.
I'll start this one. In part, I'm sorry that Rob left because I wanted to say, and I'm going to have to track him down afterwards to say, I think I've been focused on getting the policies in place and the doing. The targets and the endless debate about targets has been less of my personal focus over the last 20 years of my life. And so in 2018, what was put forward and then updated a few years later was world leading, and BC won a lot of awards for its world leading plan. But it's 2025 and many other jurisdictions are doing the same or even more than we are doing at this point. For example, we're seeing a lot of support on fuel shifting and heat pump uptake. Look to the UK and some of the policies that they have in place and the emphasis that they are putting on helping their citizens and businesses shift to electricity. And there's others. So I would say BC has a suite of policies that are good. They're good. And in order to be a leader, we need to do more. And that's what we've outlined here. We need to pick up the slack on the places that we did not act. The policies that we've outlined that are working are actually successful and reducing emissions. The ones that never got put in place obviously can't do anything. And so we need to fill in those gaps. And I'd say there's a lot of opportunities for BC to be amongst the leaders. But if you look globally now, you'll see other jurisdictions that are moving much more quickly, in part because of energy security. And jurisdictions that don't have fossil fuels to depend on are more quickly advancing on electrification because it creates energy security for nations.
Our last question goes to Zoe Yunker, the Tyee.
Yeah, I was also going to ask about the mandate relative to LNG. And I wonder if you can talk a bit more about how you distinguish those and whether you think it would have been appropriate to have that mandate be more clear when the terms of reference was put forward, and given the impact of LNG on
I might have made the misunderstanding here that LNG wasn't in our mandate. Looking at the emissions from LNG was 100% in our mandate. But as we've talked about, diving into the economy and the economic decisions and an economic plan for this government, that was not what we were tasked to do. And we feel that that's a big gap. So there's been lots of talk today about the electricity and where it's going, what LNG would require, et cetera. And we're saying, yeah, we need to actually have a very robust conversation and a greater understanding in this province about decisions and what we're going to do with our electricity. We do have a lot of opportunity to build more electricity, and we should, so that we can do many things. But we should not make one-off decisions in absence of understanding the impacts to the economy.
Okay. The other question was about gas, and I heard you say that you think gas needs to still be part of the system, the energy system, and that there should be an increased role for renewable natural gas and alternative gas products. We know that RNG supply is very limited. Even if we are going to look at expanding it, I think it's fair to say that it is a very limited entity. And that there's a lot of value in putting that really scarce resource towards industrial, like things that are really hard to decarbonize. So shouldn't we be including more concrete limits on gas in places that are easy to electrify, like homes?
Yeah, that's a great question, and happy to provide some clarification on that. So while the gas system will continue to play a role over time, that role will be diminishing in terms of the size of the gas system, but even more importantly, the throughput. So how much is flowing through it? And I think what we need to orient towards, and ultimately what we will see as electrification grows, and there are many policies that are either in place or which we're proposing, which will really emphasize that electrification. But for that period of time, and in those uses where there's a need for gas, I think ideally that could be met by renewable natural gas. So the use of fossil gas drops to zero. And over time, how much gas is flowing through the system, even in the near term, is being significantly reduced. We acknowledge that poses an existential threat to gas utilities. And so I think there are two things that we've recommended that are important. One is this need to do integrated planning across the two systems, so we have clarity about what the evolution of those systems looks like, and utilities can plan accordingly. But we've also made a recommendation that the BC Utilities Commission revisit a previous decision and look at extending some opportunities to gas utilities to actually play more of a role behind the meter in homes and buildings that are associated with electrification. And so where they would be earning their regulated rate of return on deploying capital that supports electrification. So their business model would be evolving from gas more into the electrification space, but not directly competing with BC Hydro. So still distinct roles. And we've seen examples of this in several utilities in the United States and with their regulators, where they are creating a pathway for those utilities to evolve away from gas. Because otherwise, I think that, what the evidence we have here and evidence we've seen elsewhere is, otherwise they're going to fight like hell against anything that is posing that threat, as one would expect and as their shareholders expect. So how can we get to a more deliberate plan that sees an evolution of their business model over time, so that we can also avoid that conflict and that grit in the wheels, which can make it more challenging to necessarily do the electrification that we need.
We have officially run out of time. Apologies to reporters who we could not get to for today. Thank you for joining us, everyone. That concludes today's event.